Okay, so let's begin. So this is the fifth part, and please God, next week will be the last one. I'll tell you about next week, just when we finish this one. What we're going to look at briefly tonight is we've spoken about the written Torah, the relationship between the oral Torah, what the oral Torah consists of, proofs of the oral Torah, but what about the accuracy of the oral Torah? So as you can see, I put the question there, how do we know that the oral Torah as presented in the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud, is a faithful transmission of the original oral Torah? So we can actually ask this in a different way. I can flesh it out maybe more and say, who's to say that the author of the Mishnah, that being Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, maybe he wasn't just writing down a recordal of the oral law, maybe he was inventing it. Maybe it was his own invention, God forbid. What proof is there that the text is as ancient that it came with the giving of the Torah, the written Torah? So that would be another question. And again, let's say that we have absolute faith that there was no innovation, there was no concoction by these rabbis, they didn't fool us. But we know that there was 40 generations from Moshe to Rav Ashi, and if you can recall, Rav Ashi was the chief person who was involved in redacting the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, so they were genuine, they were authentic, they had good intentions, but how do we know that we preserved it through the 40 generations? As a kid, I remember playing a game, Broken Telephone. I'm sure many of you may be familiar with it. You give a message, and it's a long message, complicated one, and one whispers it to the other, and another to the other. The time it gets from the original person to maybe the 20th recipient, the original message is absolutely lost. So even if the rabbis were absolutely genuine, how do we know with absolute certainty that that it's been accurate throughout the generations? Okay, so I've divided this into really four parts that we can know that, or have reassurance that there is the accuracy, that the oral Torah is accurate. The first one we're going to look at are checks and balances. I'll go into that a bit more in detail. The second one we look at is biblical verification. We look at verification from external sources. And then the last, and the shortest one, but probably the most important one we'll look at as well, just Hashem's covenant with us as a sufficient proof. So let's first discuss part A, checks and balances. So to ensure that there was an accurate and, as I said, faithful transmission of the oral law, the prophets and the sages put in a system to protect it from distortion, from falsehoods, and we can divide them into four categories. So the one I've put there is incentive. We can look at, I'll come to it again, is semicha. Another one is yeshiva, and the fourth one are private notes, and I'll go into each one. So the first one is, as I've called, incentive, that our sages took responsibility for receiving and transmitting the Torah, and they took on this job, they took it really seriously. And let me just show you, and the four sources I've quoted here on the document all come from Pirkei Avot. So if we just look at the first one, it comes from chapter 2, verse 14. Rabbi Elazar said, "Be diligent in your Torah study, so you will know how to answer a scoffer, apikoros, as we know." So that shows the great reward for Torah study. Second one in Pirkei Avot as well, chapter 3, verse 8. This one gives us a severe warning not to forget the Torah that we've learned. Rabbi Dostai, son of Rabbi Yanai, said in the name of Rabbi Meir, anyone who forgets even a single word of his studies is considered by the Torah as equal to someone who has incurred the death penalty. Serious. I mean, that's absolutely harsh. So making sure that when you learn it faithfully, you don't forget it, you're constantly reviewing it. That's the second one. Third one, again, also from Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Lazar of Modi'in said, someone who makes false interpretations of the Torah, again, harsh, has no share in the world to come, even if he has the merit of extensive Torah study and good deeds. So again, Pirkei Avot says, serious crime to issue false legal rulings. Make sure that what you're saying is correct, is accurate, is authentic. A fourth one also, Pirkei Avot, chapter 4, verse 13, Rabbi Huda said, be careful to ascertain the correct version as you study, for an error in one's learning is considered to be a premeditated transgression. Okay, so mistakes in our learning is like an intentional sin. So four very, very harsh references in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. The great reward for Torah study and the dire consequences of its neglect provided both a positive and negative motivation for the accurate transmission of the oral Torah. So that's, as I referred to it, that the checks and balances that were put in place by the sages. Next one I look at is smicha. I don't want us to get too confused. Smicha, as we know it today, would call rabbinic ordination, and smicha, let's call it historic smicha. So another check on the process of transmission was the institution of smicha. Now again, not to be confused with what it is today, and of course what it is today is, I'd say, a diluted form of how it was originally. So how it was originally is that in order to be authorized to carry the tradition onto the next generation, a scholar had to be ordained by someone from that generation, it's called the previous generation, who himself was ordained in this manner. So only a person who proven themselves worthy of ordination were trusted to pass the tradition further. And Rambam, Maimonides, writes down, I'll just go through it in English, and we actually see where the term smicha actually comes from. So it says, our teacher Moshe, this is the words of Maimonides, our teacher Moshe ordained Joshua, Yeshua, by placing his hands upon him, and he quotes the verse in Bamidbar, which says, Vayismoch, that's the shorish, Samach Mem Chaf, Vayismoch et yadav alav vayetzavehu. He placed his hands, Samach, upon him and commanded him. Similarly, Moshe ordained the 70 judges, and the divine presence rested upon them. These are all the words of Maimonides. Those elders ordained others, who ordained others, etc. Therefore, it turns out that whoever is ordained can trace his status back to the time of Joshua's court and even to the court of Moses. It makes no difference whether a person is ordained by the president of the Sanhedrin or by an ordained scholar who never became a member of the Sanhedrin. The point that the Maimonides is saying is because everyone who got the smicha got it from a person who went through the same process. So you had that same undiluted, the same authentic. You had to have had the credentials to be able to pass on the tradition, pass on the oral law. So firstly, we've spoken about the reward and, should we say, the punishment that's expressed in the Ethics of the Fathers, just to name one source that shows the importance of credible, authentic learning, not making mistakes, being sure to make the correct rulings. And here we have the idea of semicha, that a person was only ordained as being someone worthy to pass it on to the next generation, if he in fact had learnt it and inculcated it, was part of his being, just as it was for the person that he was receiving the smicha from. And the original source is Moses to Joshua. Then we have the concept of yeshiva, just as we know it today. In every generation, you had the oral Torah was passed on to the next, but wasn't obviously just one individual passing it on. Yes, as we said in the previous point, smicha would be given by one particular person to the next, but the teachings of the oral law was by through the yeshiva, the plural yeshivot. You had academies of learning in which the oral Torah were reviewed, they were scrutinized, and obviously they were studied in depth. Maimonides again, He says this here in the introduction to Mishnah Torah, that every leader passed on the oral tradition along with his court. So even though, again, just to elaborate more on this, even though the oral law was not written, Moshe, our teacher, as I said a little bit earlier, taught its entirety to his court, and that court was containing the 70 elders. We then know that this is the words of the Rambam, that Elazar, Pinchas, and Joshua received the entire tradition from Moses. And again, in particular, Moses, we know, was the Rebbe, the teacher of Joshua, Joshua being his primary disciple, and he obviously taught it, Moses taught it to Joshua. Similarly, Joshua throughout his life taught the oral law in the same oral form, in the same way that his teacher Moses had taught. Many then received it from Joshua. We know that Eli was the high priest. He received the tradition from the elders and from Pinchas. Pinchas was the grandson of Aaron, Moses' brother. Samuel, we know the prophet Samuel received the tradition from Eli and his court, and then King David received the tradition from Samuel and his court. So that's the idea of yeshivot, the passing of the oral learning, not just from a particular person, but the study houses of that particular individual, that person held court, so to speak. And then the last one in this section over here, of what we call the checks and balances, are notes. So as we know, even though the oral Torah before the times of the Mishnah, the redaction of the Mishnah, was taught orally, that's what it was supposed to be, the oral law. But every student, nevertheless, was permitted to write, to the best of his abilities, personal notes on the explanations, on the teachings, the laws that he had heard, as well as any new matters that had been developed in each generation. Because as we said in previous Shiurim, obviously as generations progressed, there were new ideas, new developments that came to the fore. So it may have not been something that had been passed down by a previous generation, because that generation didn't have these new developments. But now what the notes would have contained were how they'd come to a conclusion using the 13 principles of interpreting the Torah. And again, just to recap what we learned in a previous shiur, that ability to be able to interpret new laws using the 13 principles of deduction, of interpretation, that ended at the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara. But not at the time here when the oral law was being taught and notes were being taken down. So that would be the fourth one of the series, or what I call part A of the checks and balances. Then we come to the second section. I've called it the part B, part 2. And this is where we have biblical verification. I say biblical, I'm referring to the 5 books of Moshe, the part of the Tanakh, the Torah, the scroll that we take out when you read from the Torah. So we need to understand that there are many laws contained in the Mishnah and the Gemara that can be historically verified by cross-referencing them with passages that we find, that we read in the prophets and the writings, in the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim. And these are, we have many proofs in these sources, and I'll go through one, proving the authenticity of the oral Torah. Again, just to make sure I didn't go over time, I just decided to focus on the one being Shabbos. Okay, so one of the prohibitions, we know we've got the concept of 39 melachot, 39 categories of work. I don't want to go into too much detail of what constitutes work, but 39 categories are defined as prohibited actions, work on Shabbos. One of the prohibitions, one of these melachot is carrying an object from one domain to another. So the one from the Torah is carrying from a public domain to a private domain. But you don't find any reference in the Torah where it expressly mentions this prohibition. But the oral Torah, the Mishnah and the Gemara point out that there is a source. So let's actually look at the source in the Gemara itself. This comes from the Gemara Shabbos. I'm going to read just the English. It says, where is a prohibition of carrying something out of one's domain on Shabbos written in the Torah? Rabbi Yochanan said that it comes from the following verse, and he quotes, Moshe commanded, and it was announced throughout the camp, no man or woman may perform the labor of donating for sacred purposes. And as a result, the people stopped bringing. Where was Moshe stationed at this time, says the Gemara? He was in the camp of the Levites, which was, says the Gemara, a public domain. And he said to the people of Israel, do not carry things from your private dwellings into the public domain. So the Gemara concludes, we have thus found a source for the act of carrying out, but from where do we know about the act of carrying in? The Gemara says it's common logic. In either direction, it is the act of transferring from one domain to the other. So what difference does it make whether one carries out or carries in? Okay, so far we have nothing that we'd see expressed in the Torah. We need the Gemara to tell us the verse where Moses tells, and we're learning about now, Parashas Truma, where he tells the people, in fact, it comes later on, a couple of weeks on. Truma, we spoke about the mitzvah to contribute. The next few weeks, we're going to speak about the contributing. Then all the people come forth. I always joke, have you ever heard a rabbi or a chairman get up and say, enough, stop with the donations, stop, we don't need any more donations. It was the first and only time in Jewish history where the leader said, enough donations. But anyway, that's where the Gemara says it comes out of. Moses didn't want them to carry on the Shabbos from the private domain into where he was, the camp of the Levites, which was a public domain. Okay, so that's what that's what the Gemara says. Okay, but it's still important at this point to know that the Torah itself, that the written, what we know as the written Torah, doesn't make an explicit statement of this prohibition of carrying. And again, we don't see, it's not explicit in the text of the Torah, that is, that Moshe was speaking about the Shabbos day. Only through the oral law do we know that it comes from Shabbos. But again, it doesn't help us because we're saying maybe the oral law is just made up. But listen to this. This is where it comes together. We have to speak about biblical verification. So if we look in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17, God spoke the following. And this is where Jeremiah rebukes the people for desecrating Shabbos, but by specifically carrying. God spoke the following: watch over your lives and do not carry any burden on the Shabbos day or bring anything through the gates of Jerusalem. You must not carry anything out from your houses on the Shabbos day, and you must not perform any labor. You must sanctify the Shabbos day as I commanded your ancestors. Okay, that's obviously God's words as transmitted by the prophet Jeremiah. Okay, so what's important about that? We see that the prohibition is one that's found only in the Gemara. A reading of the written Torah doesn't even hint at such a law, but yet we see it being practiced even before the time of the Gemara, and that being the times of the prophets, Jeremiah. So clearly that certainly answers the question, was it fabricated by the Talmudic sages? Couldn't have been, because we see it being done earlier by Jeremiah. So the oral tradition records and doesn't make up, it doesn't concoct something that never existed before. Third part is external verification. External verification. So I put there, in addition to what can be gleaned from the Tanakh, and I just gave the one example here of Shabbos, about the existence of the oral Torah in ancient times, we can find external verification as well in other ancient texts and artifacts. Okay, so the first one I want to speak about is the Septuagint. So most of you, I'm sure, know that the Septuagint was the first Greek translation of, let's call it the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. It was initiated in Egypt. It was in the 3rd century BCE. This is actually recorded in the Gemara itself. And it was commissioned. So you had the Greek ruler of Egypt at the time was Ptolemy the Second. He ordered 70 sages, Jewish scholars. He brought them all from Jerusalem. He wanted them to translate the Torah. The interesting thing is none of them weren't sitting in the same room. They were all separate, the one from the other. And the Gemara relates that a miracle took place and that all 70 translations were absolutely identical. Okay, so how does that help us in verification? So although the existing versions of the Septuagint changed over time, as we know, the New Testament and the various translations changed, what was important is it contained biblical translations that corroborate with the oral Torah. So before I go through an example with you, if there was like an arbitrary term that you wouldn't be able to define or translate, it needed these sages to give an interpretation, a translation, a definition of the Hebrew, but they would only be able to give that if they had an oral tradition of what that meant. So let me give you an example. I've put there in point form the Omer offering the day after Shabbos. Okay, so we have the mitzvah of the Omer offering. So what was it? The Omer offering was a specified amount of ground barley that was offered by the Kohen, by the priest, in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple in Jerusalem. And it was only after this procedure for this offering had been completed was it possible for the people to then eat of the new harvest, of the produce. You've heard of terms called Chadash and Yashan. So only once this barley offering had been brought were the people then allowed to eat of the new harvest. Counting the days from the day it was offered until the festival of Shavuot is what we know today as the mitzvah of Sfirat Omer, counting the Omer. But here is where the difficulty comes in, because the Torah doesn't give us a specific date for when this Omer offering was brought. It states only Mimacharat HaShabbat. Mimacharat HaShabbat. Everyone's very familiar with that from the Hineni that you always sing over the Pesach period, the Omer period. States it was to be brought the day after Shabbat, Mimacharat HaShabbat, and that we then to count Usfartem Lachem. We have to count in 7 weeks or 49 days until Shavuot. And again, on that point, we don't even have a specific date in the Torah for Shavuot. We only know that it's 7 weeks after the bringing of that Omer offering. Okay. After relating the law of Pesach, right, the Torah goes on to relate the laws of the Omer offering and the festival of Shavuot itself, which takes place 7 weeks later. But again, we still don't know when was that Omer offering brought. We just know that the Torah says Mimacharat HaShabbat, from the day after Shabbos. So look at it over here. This is the actual source of it in the Torah, from the book of Vayikra. And again, we read this as part of our Yom Tov Leinim. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come to the land that I'm giving you and you reap its harvest, you must bring an omer of your first harvest to the priest. He shall wave it as a wave offering to God in a manner that will be acceptable to God for you. The priest shall make his wave offering, and here it is, B'macharat HaShabbat Yinifenu. He must do it on the day after Shabbos, on the day after Shabbat. So now, if you're reading that, according to what we just read there, when is the Omer offering to be brought by the priest, by the Kohen? When is the day after the Shabbos? Mimacharat HaShabbat, the day after Shabbat. Without the oral Torah, one might assume that it would refer to the very first Sunday after Pesach. So let's say the first day of Pesach is a Shabbos, is a Saturday. This would mean that the Omer offering should be brought on the Sunday. Or maybe it means another Sunday. And in fact, the Sadducees, and again, if you recall in Jewish history, the Sadducees were the sect that developed, which didn't believe in the oral law. They only subscribed to that which was written. They actually insisted that yes, B'macharat HaShabbat means the day after Shabbos, the day after, it refers to Sunday. So when Pesach begins, it would be the very first Sunday. But those who are not Sadducees and those who did subscribe to the oral law knows that the term Shabbos doesn't only refer to Shabbos, but it refers to any other festival where we have malacha, where we have the concept of work being prohibited. So we actually know that for the oral Torah, that in this context, it means Mimacharat HaShabbat, from the day after Yom Tov, the day after Pesach in this term. So here's where we actually see it. I just said it to you outside. Here we have it in the Gemara. The Shabbos refers to the festival day of Pesach. Rabbi Yossi says on the day after the Shabbos means the day after the festival. He says, well, maybe you think that the day after the festival, it means the day after the festival, but perhaps it really means the day after the Shabbos of creation, the seventh weekday. So maybe it means a Sunday. But can you really suggest that? And here we comes to the actual proof. Does the Torah state the day after the Shabbos that occurs during the Passover week? No. It merely says on the day after the Sabbath. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi says, the year is filled with Shabbos days. So if it was going to be the day after Shabbos, well, which exactly Sunday of the 52 potential Sundays could it be? It would make no sense. It would have to be that it was the Shabbos. So again, just to paraphrase what the Gemara is saying, that since the Shabbos in question is unidentified, it can't be referring to the weekly observed Shabbos of creation, so the day after the Saturday, because if it did, we wouldn't exactly know. It's not specific to know which Shabbos it's referring to. There are too many Shabboses. You have to qualify it further. So the Gemara says that it makes no sense to, in this context, that Shabbos should refer to any other Shabbos. It must refer to the festival. What is the festival in question over here? It's Pesach, and it means then that the Omer offering is brought Macharat HaShabbat, the morning after the first day of Pesach. So in other words, it's the second day of Pesach. Now, look what we have in the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua says as follows. They ate the produce of the land the day after Passover, matzah and roasted grains on that very day. So this verse in the book of Joshua tells us that they ate of the produce of the land. Why? Why were they able to eat of the produce of the land? Because the new grain had been forbidden to them up until that time, up until the day after Pesach. This is a proof, and here we see again that historically the book of Joshua takes place before the Talmud, before the Mishnah, and we see it taking place that they ate on the 16th of Nisan. From when the offering was brought, they were already eating the new grains from that produce. Okay, we also have, when you look at external verification, Josephus. So many of you would have heard about Josephus. Maybe you're not familiar with his Yiddish name, Yosef ben Matisyahu. So yes, he was a Jewish person. He became very Hellenized, and he obviously really wanted to look after himself. He wanted to preserve his own life, so he made sure that he looked after the Romans. The Romans looked after him, and he was pretty much the historian. He kept records of the time. He was very well looked after by Vespasian and by Titus, and his writings provide, as I say, external verification. So to those cynics, it's okay, you want to prove the Torah from the Torah, but what if I don't believe in the Torah type of thing? Well, here's an external historian who is the official Roman record keeper, and let's say what he has to say about certain things. And he actually, in his writings, we find verification of the oral Torah as well. Okay, so I've mentioned before in previous Shiurim, and it's always the classical one I go to, that the Torah tells us, "Ulakachtem lachem," you should take for yourselves, pri eitz hadar, the fruit of the beautiful tree, and that's what we take on Sukkot. And we know that through the Mishnah and the Gemara, we identify this fruit as the etrog. Josephus actually records an incident involving Alexander Yanai, who was the king of Yehuda in the 1st century BCE. he confirms that it was indeed the etrog that the Jews used to perform the mitzvah. And he actually writes, so Josephus writes that it came a time where the people, so this is referring to the Jewish people, rebelled against this Alexander Yanai, this Jewish king. And when he stood up on the altar, this comes from the writings of Josephus, they decided to pelt him. But they didn't pelt him with tomatoes. So guys singing out of tune today would throw rotten tomatoes. What does Josephus say that happened to throw at him? They threw etrogim, they threw citrons at him. Why? Because the people they were standing, it was a time of Sukkot, they were standing with their lulav and they were standing with the etrogim. And that's what they had, and they pelted him as a sign of their rebellion, the sign of their displeasure. This is in the writings of Josephus, they threw etrogim. So again, verification for what it says in the Mishnah and the Gemara, that what was this fruit that was used, that is not expressly stated in the Torah. It was, as the oral Torah, as the Mishnah and the Gemara says, it was the etrog. Okay, interesting to also note that Josephus also writes, again, we speak about the Sadducees, those who decided not to follow the oral tradition, they only wanted to stick to the written law. And then we have the Pharisees, those who held onto the written and the oral. And in his writings, Josephus speaks about the Pharisees being far in the majority, those who held on to their oral law, their oral traditions. And again, this is coming from an external source. Yes, you can say a Jew, but certainly a Hellenized Jew, and one that was certainly working at the bidding of his Roman masters, at the Roman emperors. Okay, we also find ancient artifacts, ancient texts that also give proof for the oral law. This actually had to do quite a bit of research on. Okay, so as I put over here, we have many examples in archaeology that demonstrate that the oral law was known in practice before the redaction of the Mishnah. That's so important, because if you want to dispel the myth that the authors of the Mishnah were also the authors of the oral tradition and they invented it, no. Because if we could find proof of oral law that predates the Mishnah, well, then we absolutely disprove that. Okay, so the written Torah, and again, we covered this in a previous shiur as well, speaks about the institution of marriage as a mitzvah, as an institution, but doesn't explain how the marriage has to take place. We know in the oral law, the Gemaras, we have two. We have Kedushin and we have Ketubot, which deal with the laws of marriage and the contracts, where marriage has to take place, the process, the responsibilities, etc. And the ketubah that the husband has to give the wife, the text that has to be written on the ketubah. And it's interesting to note that an ancient ketubah was, and this I'm reading from notes that I was able to find on the internet, an ancient ketubah was discovered among the Elephantine papyri, a collection of Jewish manuscript dating from the 5th century BCE. This document shows that the ketubah was used, and again, if you just take the dating, this ketubah, which was found, predates the Talmud by 900 years. Also, this comes from now archaeological finds. So we come to the idea of mikveh, mikvehs, ritual baths. So the Torah states that a person who's become ritually impure has to purify himself in a mikveh. We know the whole laws about taras hamishpacha, woman, and the times that she has to go to a mikveh, the times of the temple. There were so many more times. A person who had leprosy spoke lashon hara. There were many cases that a person would have to go to the mikveh to become ritually pure again. From the Torah, we know that a collection of rainwater could be used as a source of a mikveh. But we know from the oral law, again, when he speaks about the laws of a mikveh, that there are actually 3 conditions. That the mikveh has to be built into the ground. So it's not like this pool that you come and it's like this shell that these kids play in and it can be above the ground. No, it has to be actually built into the ground. Another condition that the oral law teaches us is that the water has to collect in the mikveh without ever being in any other type of container. So in other words, you can't transport the water into the mikveh. The mikveh has to collect, the rainwater has to collect naturally over there. And also we know from the oral law that in order for a mikveh to be a kosher, to be a fit for use mikveh, it has to contain at least 40 sa'ah of water. In our terminology, that's approximately 455 liters of water. But we also know that once now that you've achieved that minimum requirement, then no matter what other water you bring is fine. Whatever water touches that, even if it's come and been transported from another source, that's fine. So that we only know through the oral law. But also we find through archaeological digs that we find many mikvahot, many mikvah ritual baths that fit the fact that they were built into the ground, the size of them, knowing that they would have contained the minimum that the oral law says. And again, these mikvahs, by archaeological dating, predates the times of the Gemara. So we find that the laws of ritual purity were being practiced long before the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara. So again, it can't be the authors of the Mishnah and the Gemara who are inventing this practice for the first time. Again, we also know, and again, there are probably many more examples I could have used. We find, again, through archaeological finds, that you find in Jewish homes, which wasn't the case in non-Jewish home, that you have a lot of stone vessels. So in most non-Jewish homes, you would have, I don't know, copper, you would have bronze, you'd have wood, you'd have metal, earthenware, but you wouldn't have so much stone. What's the idea of stone? It's because the oral law teaches us that stone can't contract impurity, can't give off impurity, while other utensils that may have been more in use, more common at the time, could have. So the Jewish people, wanting to obviate the need to always go and purify utensils, or being concerned about utensils becoming tameh, becoming impure, would use stone vessels more than the norm. Again, so the fact that we find stone vessels in the remains of Jewish habitations, again, shows that the laws of purity and impurity, when it comes to the laws of vessels, was practiced long before the redaction of the Mishnah and the Gemara. This is also very interesting. We know that the laws governing burial, where the dead were to be buried, are found in the oral law. Again, the oral law tells us that when a person dies, they need to be buried outside of the city, and that was to make sure that the residents didn't, because again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the greatest impurity was tumat meit, the impurity that would be contracted by coming into contact with the dead. If a person happened to come into contact with a dead, the corpse, even if it was under the same roof, that person becomes a primary source of impurity. So normally it's only the source that remains the source, and you then become a secondary. Again, I don't want to get too technical, but a corpse was the worst type of impurity there could be. They wanted to avoid anyone coming into contact, so they were the dead were buried on the outskirts of the city. Now, tests that are employed by archaeologists in Israel to determine whether or not a settlement was Jewish was purely to find where the cemeteries were located. The cemeteries were located outside of the residential areas. You know, that was a Jewish town. And again, the fact that, again, archaeologically, you can go and find when did those people die. You can date, you can look at the bones. Predates, and even never mind that. Let's say there were headstones. Predates the times of the Talmud and the Mishnah. Again, that these laws of burial, which were only mentioned in the oral law, were practiced way before they were actually recorded in the Mishnah and the Gemara. Again, I touched on a bit earlier the idea of the etrog. The etrog comes up again. We know that. During the rebellion, the Great Rebellion, this is Bar Kokhba, the Jews minted coins, and the coins had on them the image of the etrog. So again, we know that the etrog was in use prior to the Mishnah. Okay, the last one I want to touch on, and possibly you can say maybe the most important one, is that underpinning everything, if you like, the tradition of the oral Torah that we have, that is in our possession today, and it is accurate, is we just have to think to ourselves that since we know that Hashem gave us the written Torah, and with that, the oral Torah together with it, and he wanted us to observe and preserve the mitzvahs, the only way to do that was to be able to accurately transmit and preserve them. And God himself, Hashem himself, promised that this system will remain intact. And again, those who are familiar with the morning davening, when we say the Uval Etzion, just after Ashrei, the second Ashrei, these are the words that we say at the beginning of Uval Etzion, Vani zot briti. And as for me, this is the English, this is my covenant with them, Hashem says. My spirit which is upon you and my words that I've placed in your mouth shall not depart from your mouth, from the mouths of your offspring, nor from the mouths of your offspring's offspring, Hashem said, from now until eternity. So in order for Hashem to ensure that the oral tradition would be kept intact, Hashem promised to guard over it. But nevertheless, besides the covenant, and the covenant itself should be the be-all and end-all, that should be in of itself enough proof to say Hashem promised us that it was going to be preserved. We'd have from our mouths, referring to the oral law, that was always going to be preserved. Nevertheless, as I began the Shiur by saying, the sages, the prophets themselves put in various checks and balances, incentives, etc. We see again the biblical verification, we see the external verification from writings, Josephus and others, and archaeological evidence as well, to show that practice of oral tradition predates the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, and that hopefully puts to bed the notion that the author of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and those that later redacted the Gemara didn't invent something new. They were just recording something that had been preserved from Moses all through the generations. Just want to let you know that what we'll do next week, and please God, that will be the end of the series. I didn't want to make it too drawn out. And then please God, we'll start something else. I want to just discuss the issue, and I haven't finished preparing it yet, but just the issue is, if we know that there's set halacha, and that was the framework of this whole series was structured around, then where's the place of machloket, arguments? So we know that in the Gemara we have disputes. This one says that, and this one says that. Well, then how do we know with certainty what the halacha is? If this one's arguing, this one's arguing, we have their arguments preserved, where does the role of machloket, argument, fit within what we've said up until this point, oral Torah, the authenticity, the fact that halacha is established? So please God, we'll discuss that next week, same time, 7:30. I wish everyone a good night and a good week. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Pleasure.